Hi there and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now today we enter into part 5 of the layout extension, and today's video is really predominantly about beginning to set up the actual track itself. So the first part of this video is looking at wiring up a Electro-frog point, and then I lay a section of track that covers the new incline, and this is so I can actually test how some of my locomotives, or actually in one case a particular locomotive, operates on this new incline. So without further ado, let's just get into the first part of this video, which is about wiring up an Electro-frog point. So in terms of the points for this new extension, I'll just focus on this particular one here. So this is a Pico curved point, and essentially there's a number of ways of adding point motors, of course, to your Pico points, and of course there's quite a number of point motor options as well. Now on my layout I just simply use the Pico solenoid point motors, which are these little wee items here. Now the reason I use these is basically because they're cheap, and the majority I have bought second-hand, because interestingly people might go and replace all their solenoid point motors with tortoise point motors or cobalt motors or something like that, and they end up with a box full of these which they sell online for ridiculously low price. And so therefore I've collected up quite a large number of these, and they all work. There's nothing wrong with them. They're just an older style Pico solenoid point motor. So that's that item which I use. The next I also use, because this particular point is a Electro-frog point, and slowly but surely I'm replacing all my Incline-frog points with Electro-frog, because it is more reliable, and certainly when it comes to short wheelbase locomotives, for example 040s and 060s, you don't sort of run into the issue of dead sections of track. So for the Electro-frog wiring I use one of these here, which of course is the Pico PL13, which is just used to switch the polarity of the frog, and of course this item just sits mounted on the bottom of the point motor. So we'll go through the process of wiring up this particular point here and the method I use. Now unlike a lot of people, they just simply drill a hole in underneath the switch blades in here and thread through a version of this motor that has a longer rod poking through. Now I actually mount the point motors directly underneath the actual point itself, which means I actually cut out a rectangular hole in the track bed. So we'll go through the process of doing that now. Also just wiring it up, a little bit of soldering, and also some other sort of methods that are involved in what I do in terms of installing point motors. So in order to wire up this point with a point motor and a PL13, which we have the box for that there, and we have our point motor and the PL13, and of course our Electro-frog point. Now the Electro-frog point has this wire protruding out of the frog, and so there's some modifications to do to this. Now there's loads and loads of videos out on YouTube that go through the process describing how this all works, and I'm just popping a link up in the top corner from a channel called Dean Park, and he actually has a video which does a very good description of how to go about wiring up one of these points. But a few things to cover in terms of tools. There's sort of various things that you might need. Of course, you might need a pencil. You're going to possibly need, well, in my case I need a ruler. We've got our calipers, we've got craft knife, and we have selection of wire, so there's various different colours. Also a multimeter comes in handy, and we of course have our soldering iron, and of course wire strippers, and that's pretty much it in terms of the tools. So what I'm actually going to show you first up though, before we get into this, is essentially the method I use. I don't, as I mentioned before, I don't drill a hole just for the pin to go through the baseboard. I use the method of actually mounting the motor directly to the underside of the point, which means that you don't need to buy the mounting plates that Pico provide, and essentially you end up with a unit like that with the motor attached. Now what that basically means is that you then have to cut a rectangular hole in the baseboard for where the motor is going to be positioned. Now the only issue with that, having a rectangular hole here, is when you're doing ballasting, there is a much higher risk of all the ballast just pouring down through the hole, getting into the actual point motor and basically jamming it up. So what I actually do in terms of solving this issue in here is I basically actually use the plastic that, for example, maybe the PL13 comes in, and this is the box from this wee switch here. So I chop that up and basically make up a little plastic plate that actually sits between the motor and the point. So if I actually take this point motor back out, and with the holes and so forth that I've drilled, we can slot that on to the point motor, and then once that's on there, then we can actually pop the point back on top. So basically once you've mounted the motor on the underside of the point, we now have this plastic sleeve, and it's pretty thin, so you really want this to be as thin as possible so that you're not sort of really warping the track if you're planning on fixing it down with pins. So it essentially creates a cover over where the rectangular hole in the baseboard will be, and then of course you've got the easy movement to switch the point rails. So that's basically the method I use. Now in order to make this template, I essentially just draw it up on the computer, and here I've just sort of ganged up 8 of them, and then just double-sided taped a sheet of plastic. Now this piece came, I think, might have been out of a Metcalf packet. You could also use the plastic that Pico points come in as well, and essentially just lay that over the top and just a bit of double-sided tape to stop it from moving around, and cut the holes out. Now you could drill the holes, but the problem with drilling them with this very thin plastic is it does tend to sort of chew the holes a bit. So I actually use these hole punches. Now they're actually, I think, really designed for leather work and punching holes, yeah, for, you know, things like buckles and belts and that kind of thing. And of course you can get them in all sorts of different sizes, but these work actually really quite well for cutting out these holes. So we've got a large one there to cut the center hole, which is to allow for movement of the pin, and then we've just got the little wee small one for the tabs on the point motor, which will poke through. So in terms of modification to the point, we can see the tiny little wires that are bridging the gap between those 2 rails in the middle. So the first thing we need to do is remove those wires. So I sort of find the easiest way to get these wires out is I actually just get a thin screwdriver and get it in underneath the wire, and basically give it a bit of a tug, and it breaks the solder. So that hasn't actually broken the solder, it's actually literally broken the wire in half. But if we just get a pair of pliers and we'll pull those wires out. So I think it's important really to not just cut the wire, because there is the off chance that it could just simply reconnect, because the last thing you want to do is have any connection made here, otherwise you'll end up shorting the track supply. Right, so that's removed those thin wires, and we have a clear gap there to isolate the frog. So the next part will be of course soldering up some wiring for this point motor, and I've got an example here of one that I've done which is going in a different area of the layout, so it kind of is going to end up looking a little bit like this, and I've adopted a set of color coding. So the common for the point motor is brown, and then we've got orange and yellow for left and right, if you can just see under there. The green wire is for the frog, and this sort of follows what a lot of other people do in terms of green being the colour of a frog. And then we have the track power, which of course is running through this switch to alternate between the left and right rails for the frog, and that is simply wired up with black and red, which is what I use for the positive and negative rails, and or left and right rails, or whichever way you want to look at it. And that is simply wired up as a mini sort of JST plug. So once these are threaded through, so you'll end up with your hole for the point motor. You'll have a wee hole, small hole drilled for this cable, and then a small hole drilled for the frog power. So essentially, that once these are threaded through, those two join together and these two join together. So we'll go ahead and wire up this point motor, and of course it's good to have a selection of colours. So we've got our common for the brown, we have our yellow, and we have our orange, and then we've got our green for the frog. Now, one other thing that I actually also do before I sort of go ahead and begin to wire everything up, because these are second-hand point motors, I always like to check to make sure that the point motor is fully operational before I actually go and wire it up and install it on the point. So the easiest way to do that, just grabbing a 9-volt battery with one of its little harnesses connected to it, and the main thing is just to tap it, so you don't want to hold the wires on it, or otherwise you're going to burn out the point motor. But I'll just put power on one side and then just tap the terminal, and the theory is if it works it will switch over, and there we go. And then try it at the other end on the other terminals, and there we go. So we know that this point is working. So there's our wires soldered on, so we've got an orange and a yellow for left and right, and then our brown on the rear for common. Now at this point I also test it again because I just want to make sure that using soldering iron you don't want to burn out the coils that are in there. I guess that really sort of comes down to not lingering too long with the soldering iron on these contacts. So just testing once again, we've got our battery. I've just hooked up the black to the common, and we'll just try. There we have it. So that's all operational. Right, with the wires now soldered on to the point motor, we will attach the PL13 which goes on top. Now these are old point motors, as I've mentioned, so I'm just using a little bit of IPA and just cleaning the top of the point motor where the PL13 is going to be glued, because these I think may have previously had PL13s mounted on them before, and there's a little bit of residue there, so I'll just give them a bit of a clean, and we just simply mount this on here. Now I mean the only unusual thing about this is there isn't really any other way of mounting this on here apart from gluing the switch on, and the main thing is that the switch here slides through. So I'm just using a little bit of my trusty old Zap glue. Right, so that's got the switch glued on. Now the next step is to wire up these terminals, and as per this other point that I'd made up, we have a plug connecting that, which connects to that. So we have the connection there once this is mounted, and then the green being the frog cable. And once again, with all the wiring that I do, I tin the wire first. So it's the frog wire now connected. And that's the black and red wires now connected at that end. So this switch essentially means that when that is in that position, it's connecting the black wire, and then when it's flicked over to that position, it's connecting the red wire. So with this cable for the power supply to the frog switch, I've stripped off a reasonable amount of the plastic coating so that we have got more wire exposed, and then it is a case of simply soldering both sets of wires across both sides of the two rails as well. Now at this point, this is where, based on the wiring for my layout, we work out which is the red and which is the black. So on the station road layout, I wire the inside rail as red and the outside rail as black. So first up, we'll just tin these wires. And then we're just going to put a wee blob of solder on each of the back of these rails. And now we can actually solder these wires in place. So if you can see there, we now have those wires soldered in, and the red being on the inside and the black being on the outside. And that is what we hook into the other end of that, which feeds through to the frog switch. Now it's at this point where it's important to make sure that the point motor is around the right way when you mount it on the underside of the point. So as we can see, we have the black on this side and the red on that side. Now the black and the red on this point motor has to correspond to the same sides. So in other words, the point motor has to be this way around. So the black, which is on this side of the motor, is on that side of the point, and then the red, which is on this side of the switch, is on the same side as the red on the track. If we had it around the other way, we'd end up, I think, with a short if it was that way around. So it's this way around that it needs to go when we mount it into the track. So we'll mount the point motor onto the underside of the track now, and we've got our wee plastic plate, and that's what we end up with, that mounted in there. And what I actually do in terms of these tabs that are poking through, some people sort of bend them over so that they're bent over the top of the sleeper here to anchor it in. I actually just give them a bit of a twist, and that seems to suffice. So sort of like a 45-degree twist. It also means that if you need to take the motor off, you can just simply untwist the tabs rather than having to try and pry them up. So that's now firmly in place, and you can see I've just done a wee twist on it instead. So the one last bit to do is we're just going to solder a little bit of green wire onto the frog cable here. So that's the point now sort of prepared and ready for installation onto the track bed. So before I actually took the point out, I'd actually just traced around the sleepers that are part of where the point mechanism is that sits underneath. So that sort of directly relates to that outline there. So essentially what I do, just using another piece of clear plastic, this is slightly larger than the area, but it's smaller than the other piece of plastic, which is mounted on the actual point itself. So basically I just sort of line it up more or less centered where the outline tracing was taken, and then draw an outline around that. And now that rectangle, the outer rectangle, is actually the hole that's cut in the track bed. Right, so we've now cut the hole out for the point. There's another small hole here, which is for the frog power, which is this one here, and then another little wee hole here, which is for the single frog wire as well. So we'll just slip all of this stuff in, and hopefully it all should fit in. And there we go. So that is installed and ready to be wired up. We can connect up these two here because they will connect to each other. And that is basically to alternate the frog power. Then we've got the two green wires, which I'll just simply join up underneath here. And that's pretty much that installed. So from this point really I can sort of anchor this down. I've also got to, at the moment I've just got some metal fish plates in there. They need to be changed out for insulated fish plates just on these two here, otherwise you'll end up with a short in there. Now you're probably wondering, well, if this area is not going to be ballasted, what is the point in putting in this sort of plastic cover over the point mechanism? And I mean, basically I sort of do this everywhere anyway, because eventually over time grit builds up in here. If you're ever using any kind of track rubbers or anything like that, that will just eventually end up falling through between the sleepers and filling up the actual point solenoid system itself, and who knows what might end up happening. They'll probably just end up clogging up and jamming. So I put these in here even in the non-scenic section where there isn't going to be any ballast. But the idea behind these plastic covers around here is that you can bring the ballast up reasonably close around here and it's not all going to fall down through the hole. So now that the Electro-frog point is in place, this then allows me to now anchor down the rest of the track that then actually proceeds down the incline towards the lower level. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the key reasons to doing this is so that I can actually test one of my locomotives on the incline and just see how it goes. So we'll switch over to that now and take a closer look. So I've now begun to anchor down some of the track and also put in some dropper wires, which I haven't got connected yet, but they're ready and waiting to go. And because this is the non-scenic area of the layout, it doesn't really matter too much if I've sort of recycled some of my track rather than laying down new track. So this has been recycled from other parts of the layout. As long as it's straight and clean and reasonably secure, it does the trick. So I have placed the track here, trimmed and cut it all to the right lengths and just pinned the track in place. And of course there's more sort of holes drilled here and there where more dropper wires are going to be added, and around to the beginning of the fiddle yard, which will probably be early next year. So one of the key aspects now that I've got this track in place and connected up, so it has got power to it, although it is coming from where it's connected to the original track, as I haven't wired up any of the droppers yet. But what I really want to find out is how well some of my locomotives will traverse this incline. And there's one particular locomotive that I'm going to use in this test. It's one of my favourite locomotives, but unfortunately, because of its 060 wheelbase, it doesn't have as much traction. So the locomotive in question is the Hornby Q1 class. Now, in this hopefully successful test, I'll be using this locomotive pulling a rake of wagons, which is the exact same configuration that I had when I was installing a DIY magnetic adhesion system, and there's a link up in the top corner all about that. Because with this locomotive and the particular arrangement of stock, which is not a huge length of stock, unbelievably, it could not make it up that incline. It would just sit there and its wheels would spin. Now I'm going to use the exact same arrangement, so the locomotive and the particular rake of wagons, and just see if this locomotive can actually pull its set of wagons up the new incline without the aid of any magnetic adhesion. So we'll flick over now and let's just see how it goes. So there we have it for part 5 of the layout extension, and probably the most pleasing aspect so far is that my class Q1 can actually climb the incline, which it otherwise couldn't do on the previous incline. So I'm really quite happy about that, and that is actually done, of course, without the aid of my DIY magnetic adhesion system. So just to conclude, you would have noticed my rather attractive looking t-shirt that I'm wearing, and just thought I'd take this opportunity here to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas, so to all the viewers and subscribers. And I'd say for probably most of us, we're quite happy to also close the door on 2020. It's been a very bizarre year, almost something out of Twilight Zone. So here's hoping that 2021 is a better year. So one particular viewer actually asked me where things are at in my neck of the woods, just in terms of the COVID-19 issues and the restrictions and lockdown borders and all of that kind of thing. So I guess I've been watching the global news quite a lot, and of course I've been acutely aware of the quite severe COVID issues in other countries, and I think we all know who those countries are. And I have been aware also of some of the media coverage that is being cast in other countries about New Zealand's efforts in the COVID war. And yes, I would honestly say I think we have got off kind of lightly here in New Zealand, but there's a couple of reasons I believe that we have had more success. Firstly, right from the word go, our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern described the effort required to combat this nasty bug was to work as a team, and only when you work as a team can things maybe start to happen. And I think that is absolutely true to the word. So the majority of New Zealanders have put in a team effort in order for us to have maybe more freedoms than other countries do. Secondly, I think our population does help. We are a small country. There is only 5 million New Zealanders here, and that is quite a contrast to, say, 60 million or 300 million people, and so it's easier, I think, to control any outbreaks. And thirdly, really, it's our location. We're really a million miles from anywhere, so I think a combination of all of those things has certainly helped New Zealand remain relatively unscathed in terms of this COVID outbreak. So that doesn't mean to say that my thoughts and best wishes do go out to all the other people around the world, and particularly in areas of the world where COVID has really taken a hold. So my thoughts are definitely with those who are affected in that way and their families. So I will sign off now. Take care, everyone, and a very Merry Christmas to all, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.